Good afternoon, everybody. Just going to wait a few minutes, let people get in and arrive. Not a few minutes, a minute or so. I'd like to thank you for joining. Just give it about 15 more seconds. All right, we'll get started. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Charity Village webinar. Before we get started, my name is Luigi Marshall. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at Charity Village. And as we're gathering here on a virtual platform, it's important to acknowledge that each of us is joining this webinar from the ancestral or unceded lands of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people. As a settler on this land, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee people. For those who may be joining a Charity Village webinar for the first time, Charity Village is Canada's largest online job board for the nonprofit sector. In addition to our online job board, organizations can also post volunteer positions. So if you're looking for work or to recruit talent in the sector, Charity Village is a great place to start. We also have a ton of excellent resources for nonprofit professionals, including online courses, articles, fundraising tools, and free webinars like the one we're presenting today. Before we start today's webinar, I'd like to quickly run through a couple items. You may have noticed when you joined that you were automatically put on mute. Since we have hundreds of participants in today's session, it's important for us to minimize the amount of background noise so that everyone can clearly hear the presentation. However, you can still ask questions and make comments using the question box at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. Look for that at the bottom of your screen. And I'd like to note that's the Q&A button, not the chat button. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions as you think of them, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. You can also email your questions to webinars@charityvillage.com. We will not have time to answer specific questions related to your organization's compensation structure or role-specific questions. However, please feel free to ask questions regarding how to read the report, trends in the sector, and generalized questions. If you happen to encounter any technical issues with the webinar, whether with viewing the presentation or with the audio, please let us know in the question box or by sending us an email. We'll do our best to get any technical difficulties resolved as quickly as possible, but in a worst-case scenario, please remember that we are recording today's webinar, and we will send you the full recording by email tomorrow. So if you get called away or disconnected, you will still be able to view the full presentation. And with that, I'd like to welcome our presenters for today, Jack Shand, Executive Partner of the Portage Group, and Jeff Thacker, Executive Partner of the Portage Group. Over to you.
Thank you, Luigi, and good afternoon, everyone. Jack and I are happy to join you today to deliver a webinar on the 2023 Canadian Nonprofit Sector Salary and Benefits Report. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to tell you a little bit about us, give you an overview of the study and who participated, review some high-level compensation findings, provide some insights into how to use the data, and we'll wrap up with a discussion on the sector compensation trends to help you make the case in today's environment. We will, as Luigi noted, we will have a question and answer session at the end. If you have questions as we're going through, please feel free to put them in the question area, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So we are the Portage Group. We are a full-service management consulting firm focused on the distinct needs of the not-for-profit sector. Combined, our team of experts have served over 300 associations, regulators, and charities in the areas of market research, strategic planning, organizational design, and executive recruiting. Our research team has conducted hundreds of projects, including over 40 compensation studies for organizations such as Charity Village and the Canadian Society of Association Executives. I am Jeff Thacker, executive partner of the research practice at the Portage Group and one of its founding partners. I've been conducting research for over 25 years, leading projects of all kinds. And for the last 20 years, I've focused almost exclusively on associations and other nonprofits. Among the hundreds of projects I've conducted, I've led dozens of compensation studies, including all 8 of Charity Village studies going back to 2011. And prior to working in this sector, I worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers, playing a lead role in their market research practice. Over to you, Jack.
Thank you, Jeff. Good day, and thank you all for joining us. Briefly, my career has been largely in the nonprofit sector at the CEO or the executive director level in 3 positions over approximately 15 years, each with a prominent national organization, and now in the management consulting world. I'm a fellow of the management consulting profession, an Honored Life Award recipient through the Canadian Society of Association Executives, and a certified association executive. I've also been active as a volunteer over the years, ranging from board roles, chairing fundraising for regional and national charities, and in the education sector with a university's business school. Jeff, back to you.
Thanks, Jack. So just a bit of an overview before we get into some results. Data was collected through various channels in May of this year. And in all, 1,350 organizations participated in the study. Each survey allowed respondents to provide compensation on and benefits information for an unlimited number of individual staff members, grouped into 6 staff levels. In all, there were almost 5,400 positions reported. Bullets below you show you the distribution by staff level. And in some cases, respondents reported positions that covered groups of staff. So including those groups, the study actually represents almost 1,800 individual staff in the sector, or 18,000 individual staff in the sector. Today's webinar primarily focuses on compensation. However, it is important to note that the study does also cover the type and value of employment benefits offered in the sector, and you can refer to the report for those benchmarks. So a few study limitations. Compensation figures are as of May 2023. Results are based on the survey responses, and they're only as accurate as the information that was provided by participants. The survey was conducted using Charity Village's subscriber lists and social media, and is not a random sample. Accordingly, the results may or may not be accurate representation of the total nonprofit sector in Canada, and the findings of this study reflect only the views of those organizations that participated. Additionally, professional and trade associations and foundations were generally not included in the study, as they do tend to skew the data, and there are other sources available with compensation benchmarks for those groups. The overall results are very robust. However, there are some smaller segments where they should be interpreted with caution due to the smaller sample sizes. So who participated in the study? Well, consistent with previous studies, just over half of participating organizations were headquartered in Ontario, while BC accounts for 1/5 of participating organizations. Alberta has significant representation at 11%. 7 in 10 participating organizations were registered charities, and a significant 4 in 10 respondents represent local organizations. Regional and national groups each account for 1/5, while provincial organizations account for just under 1/5. And as shown here, there's also a good mix of organizations by size in terms of the number of staff and budgets. So while many components make up the overall compensation package, by far the most common benchmark is cash compensation. Unlike other components of compensation, the value of cash compensation is easy. It's easy to compare from one employee to the next. Over the next few pages, I'm going to provide a high-level summary of cash compensation for 2023. and more detailed and specific benchmark comparisons are available in the report. So here we have a summary of cash compensation by staff level. The teal bar represents the average base compensation, while the small sliver of orange represents the average bonus cash compensation. Not surprisingly, cash compensation generally increases with seniority, the one exception being level 2 senior executives, where the average is actually on par with level 1 chief executives. And in many years, the level 2 compensation, the average is actually higher than level 1. This is one of the most common questions we get, is how can level 1 compensation be equal to or even higher than level 1? Well, this is because while most organizations have a chief executive, most are not large enough to also have a senior executive position. So subsequently, the level 2 position is more likely to exist in only larger organizations where pay at all levels tends to be higher. In situations where you do have both a level 1 and a level 2 in the same organization, the level 1, the chief executive, is almost always paid more than the level 2 executive. And this has been consistent since the first study in 2011, and is also consistent with other research we've done in the sector. So as seen here, in 2023, chief executives earn on average $111,000 or $111,600, of which $110,200 is in the form of base compensation. As mentioned a moment ago, level 2 senior executives are on par with the chief executive at an average of $111,200, followed by level 3 senior management at $92,400. After that, there's a significant drop off to level 4 at $69,000, and then the non-management levels, we have program staff level 5 at just below $48,000, and support staff at just above $45,000. Consistent with previous years, bonus cash does not represent a significant portion of compensation sector-wide. In fact, only 1 in 10 participating organizations reported offering a formal incentive plan to at least one level of staff. And this has been consistent going all the way back to 2011. Chief executives are most likely to receive bonuses, with 15% reporting that they have this type of compensation. Senior executives are next at 13%, followed by senior management at 12%, and management supervisory at 9%. Below the management levels, it's 5% or less that are receiving bonuses. Across all chief executives, including those who did not receive a bonus, the average incentive compensation amounts to 0.9% of base salary. But if we look at only those who received bonuses, the actual average paid out is 5.9% of base salary. Similarly, for senior executives, the average is 0.6% for the sector as a whole, but 4.6% for just those who receive it. The other two management levels are quite similar. For non-management, the sector-wide average is 0.2% or less for all employees, but for just those who receive bonuses, the average actual payout is between 2.1 and 3.2% of base compensation. So how has compensation changed? Well, since from 2022 to 2023, the average compensation increased at all levels except for level 5 program staff, where the benchmark actually decreased. The biggest gains over the 12 months before the study were among chief executives, level 1, where the average increased by 10.7%, followed by senior management, level 3 at 8.6%, and management supervisory, level 4 at 7.5%. Growth at other levels was more modest at 3.8% or less. Now, while level 5 did see a decline in the average compensation this year, it is worth noting that they were the group that had the highest increase in the 2022 study. Now, some of these increases are obviously closer to inflation than others. However, it's important to note the longer term trend, which smooths out some of the study to study peaks and valleys. So over the last 10 years, since 2013, compensation has been rising at an average rate of 0.7% to 2.4%, depending on level, per year. Over that same time frame, the average inflation rate was 2.5%. So obviously, this means that compensation growth rates over the last 10 years generally fall short of inflation. But as you know, inflation has been exceptionally high over the past 2 years. More specifically, from June 2021 to June 2023, the annual inflation rate averaged at 5.4%, and that's compared to just 1.8% annually over the previous 8 years. So looking a little more recently, since December 2020, 2 studies ago, to May 2023, inflation was up by a total of 14.3%. By comparison, the average management compensation in that time is up 9 to 14%, depending on level, while non-management compensation is up only 4%. So are nonprofit staff really falling behind compared to inflation? Well, to assess this, let's compare growth using a common index, starting at 2013. The thick black line represents inflation. It shows that if you were paid $100 in 2013 and received raises equal to inflation, your pay would have increased a total of 27.6% to be $127.60 in 2023. Let's add the chief executives to the graph. So for a chief executive who received an increase every year equal to the average increase in the benchmark compensation from 2023, their compensation would have been increasing generally in step with inflation up to 2020. Now, we do show a gap between the lines in 2018, but it did bounce back for 2020. However, in the last 3 years, chief executive compensation has actually been playing catch up. The trend line actually suggests that the increases were reactionary to the rapid inflation in 2021 and 2022, and do show that the gap does appear to be closing again. So overall, average chief executive compensation is slightly behind inflation over the 10 years. For someone who made $100,000 in 2013, they would have been earning $123,600 in 2023. That would be $4,000 or 3.1% lower than if their increases had been based on inflation. So we see a similar story for the other 2 senior management levels. Though level 3 senior management average compensation looks to have been falling consistently behind inflation from 2013 to 2020 before it really started to climb. Interestingly, the average compensation for level 4 supervisory staff has actually fared the best and is just off the pace of inflation for over the 10 years by the time you get to 2023. For non-management staff, for support staff, they generally followed, or the average generally followed the inflation trend line up until 2020, but has yet to see the rapid climb that the management staff have. And as noted earlier, level 5 has actually declined this year, but the trend line generally shows that it's generally been behind the inflation trend. Now, we don't know what inflation is going to be over the next 10 years, but if you look back, you will see that from 1993 to 2020, inflation in Canada averaged 1.75% per year. And the highest inflation in that time was 2.9%, which was in 2011. So while the gap has increased between inflation and compensation did in 2022, history does suggest that over the long run, nonprofit compensation, particularly at the management levels, will generally experience a market correction to line up with inflation. Now, it's important to note that the changes in the average compensation for the sector does not necessarily mean that individual employees are seeing those same changes. It's just a change in the average benchmark. The change in the sector average also reflects, all the promotions, staff hirings, firings, and other changes. Over the 12 months before the study, between 71 and 80% of staff, depending on level, reported experiencing an increase in compensation. The one exception is chief executives, level 1, where only 61% reported an increase. The average increase for those levels was between 3.9% and 4.3% for 4 of 6 levels. The exceptions were level 4 and level 6, where the average increases were 3.4% and 3.3% respectively. It should be noted that the average sector change does also include those who did not experience any change or who maybe saw a decrease. Looking ahead to the next 12 months, increases are expected for between 68 and 78% of staff, depending on level. The exception again being chief executives, where only 59% expect an increase. The average increases for the coming 12 months are anticipated to be a bit lower than in the past 12 months, ranging from 2.4% to 3%. One exception is the level 5 program staff, where the anticipated average change is 3.8%, which is on par with the 3.9% they saw in the past 12 months. Also shown here are the same results from the 2022 study for reference purposes. But it is interesting to note that at all levels, the average actual change from the past 12 months, which is the blue bar in the graph on the left, exceed the anticipated average increase from the last study, which is the orange bar in the graph on the right. So predictions a year ago were lower than what actually happened. So now let's look at how to use the data to establish a salary range. So the first step is to identify the applicable benchmarks for the organization and the staff profile. So let's use a case study. We have Leela, who is the chief executive of a registered charity based in Calgary. Leela and the board have agreed to undertake a compensation review, and she needs to gather information to help her and the board agree on a competitive compensation package going forward. Accordingly, she turns to the 2023 Canadian Nonprofit Sector Salary and Benefits Study. And as a first step, Leela creates a profile of her organization and herself. And in addition to the attributes I just mentioned, the scope of her charity is local. It's a medium-sized organization with 15 staff and a budget of approximately $2.5 million. It's not formally affiliated with other organizations, and Leela has 12 years of experience in her discipline and holds a bachelor's degree. So with her profile in hand, Leela turns to page 73 of the report to reference the detailed benchmarks for chief executives in registered charities. And she proceeds to note the relevant benchmarks that match her profile. And there's 9 in all. She also knows that compensation tends to vary by geography. So she also looks on page 98, she finds the detailed table summarizing benchmarks for the chief executive position in Alberta. And again, she notes the 9 applicable benchmarks. To make things easier, or to make the data easier to work with, she copies all the relevant data points to an Excel worksheet. And as a starting point, she's going to look at total cash compensation, knowing that that is the ultimate benchmark that she wants to end up at, regardless of the compensation structure. But looking at the table, or at the summarized table, she does recall seeing something about quartile ranges in the report and wonders if the benchmarks line up with expectations. To confirm the selected benchmarks are appropriate for her organization, Leela references the chief executive quartile ranges presented on page 71 of the report for registered charities and page 96 for the Alberta market. Now, different organizations fit into different classes when it comes to compensation. The class an organization belongs to will depend on many factors, such as the profile of the charity, the constituents it serves, the type of work it does, the size of the organization, where it's located, etc. Now, organizations can generally be classified into 4 compensation groups or quartiles. And the quartiles divide respondents into 4 equal groups according to their salary, so 25% in each group. These quartile ranges should be used as a basic guideline in deciding the caliber of employee you wish to attract or retain. Accordingly, they can be used to determine if the selected benchmarks and the final result line up with expectations. So based on her knowledge of her organization and her own profile and current compensation, Leela recognizes that while they're probably not in the top tier, they are certainly above averages. So she feels that the 3rd quartile is probably most appropriate. And when she checks her selected benchmarks, she notices that all but one would fall within the 3rd quartile. And the one that's outside is just outside that range. So accordingly, she feels that these benchmarks are a good comparator for her situation. She also does the same for the Alberta market. And she notes that all but 2 of the Alberta benchmarks fall within the 3rd quartile for the Alberta market. So again, she's comfortable that the Alberta benchmarks are a good comparator for her organization. So now that she has her benchmarks, Leela can determine an appropriate an appropriate range for her position. Now, a couple notes. When setting a range based on benchmarks, there's no one correct way to do it. The data from the report, it's only a guideline to point you in the right direction and make decisions based on supporting data. Setting a range is part math and it's also partially a judgment call. But ultimately, you want to set a range that is competitive enough to attract and retain quality staff. In cases where you have an incumbent, it will be important to keep in mind the cost to replace that staff person. And then deciding on your final benchmarks, you should give the greatest weight to the comparables of closest fit. Now, with that in mind, following our 3 possible approaches based on Leela's chosen benchmarks. And the latter 2 are just variations of the same approach. The first approach is simple and straightforward. You simply identify the high and low values in your benchmarks. In this case, the overall revenue benchmark for registered charities is the high at 130,719, and the low is the undergraduate degree in Alberta at 91,988. Together, these would form your range, which when rounded is 92,000 to 130,700, with a midpoint of $111,350. A slight variation to consider on this option or any option is dropping the high and the low for dropping the high and the low and going with the second highest and second lowest. Typically, you would only do this when the high or low is significantly out of line with the other benchmarks. Now, in Leela's situation, you might notice that the bottom two benchmarks and the top two benchmarks are actually quite a bit outside the range of the rest of the benchmarks. So this is an approach that Leela may want to consider. Now, if she did just drop the high and low, you would end up with a range of 94,000, which is the staff benchmark for Alberta, to 126,000, which is the revenue benchmark in Alberta. And the midpoint would be 109,950. Now, if you are going to drop the low, you should also be dropping the high, and rather than just cherry picking. The second common approach is to take the average of all your benchmarks to establish the midpoint, and then set a range using a percentage variation. Now, let's assume the variation for the range is 10% from the midpoint. We start by calculating the average of all the benchmarks, which when rounded is $109,000. Next, we calculate the variance, which is 10,900. And to get the range, we simply add this number to get the high point, or add this number to the midpoint to get the high upper limit, and subtract it to get the lower limit, giving us a range of 119,900, or sorry, a range of 98,100 to 119,900 with a midpoint of 109,000. Now, the third and final approach is similar to the second approach. The difference is that instead of taking the average of all benchmarks together, we take averages separately for the major categories, which would be registered charities and Alberta, and then calculate the midpoint of these as the of these major benchmarks for them. So again, we use 10% variance, and the average for registered charities is 109,261, and the average for Alberta is 108,706, giving us a midpoint of 108,893, which just happens to be exactly the same as the average we used on the previous page. Now, these are the same because the benchmarks are evenly split, 6 apiece in each of our major categories. If the number of benchmarks in each group were not the same, so if we had 7 in one and 5 in the other, then the result would be different than what we had using the previous approach. Now, this is the approach that we actually use when we do custom analysis, and we use it because it allows you to give more weight to one factor or another where appropriate. The ranges presented represent the published range. Typically, an organization will hire qualified staff toward the midpoint of this range, and the highest point in the range would potentially be earned by staff who are senior in the position, whose performance is consistently above the average. Leela's personal benchmarks, experience, and education would be used to determine where in the range she falls, and benefits, if offered, would be in addition to this. And at the chief executive level, benefits add an average of $12,000 in compensation to the package. Using the report, you can use the value of benefits as a guideline, and then determine what benefits will fit within that budget, or the value can alternatively be added as cash compensation. There's lots of different benchmarks in the report to help you. We also do custom runs where we go back to the raw data to develop more precise benchmarks than what's available in the report, if that's of interest. Now, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack, who's going to tell you a bit about trends and making the case in 2024.
Thank you, Jeff. We will now focus on the environment in which we'll be making the case for changes to compensation in the coming months. I want to share an overview of the market we're in and information that could influence compensation decisions. I'll be including some ideas that should help you to either grow your own remuneration and or your potential to earn more in the future. 1 year ago, we saw inflation hovering around 7%. Many have had to budget for higher expenses, whether for groceries, accommodation, or other needs. Central bank rate setting was designed to bring inflation down, and that's happening. When financial advisors say that inflation is in the rearview mirror, it's not to suggest we're out of the woods, but rather we're moving in the right direction with further interest rate reductions to come. Higher interest rates are intended to cool down the economy. That result appears to be succeeding. There was a news article just this week that restaurants are seeing a significant decline in-person dining, 9% lower in Toronto in just the past month, and guest counts down also right across Canada. However, a recession has other consequences, higher unemployment, for example, and that will potentially affect compensation as there will be more competition for fewer jobs. Many of you will be familiar with Glassdoor and may have used them for insight about a prospective employer. Glassdoor recently surveyed employees about their confidence outlook, specifically how they see their own employer's business prospects. It's noteworthy that this study found that employee perspectives on their own employer's future is at the lowest reading ever. But employees needn't try to forecast the future for their employer or for their sector because they can see firsthand what's happening in their personal lives. For staff who rent, they are facing accommodation costs at a record high in Canada. The average rent in Canada now is over $2,000 a month. For employees with a home and mortgage, according to TransUnion, their monthly installment has increased on average by 15% in the last year. Mortgage rates have been the biggest factor in terms of the impact on the household budgets of Canadians. It's the largest contributor to inflation, according to Trading Economics. Of course, not every person with a mortgage had to renew at a higher rate in the past 12 months, and others will face that hit to their budgets come renewal time in the next year. Millennials will be particularly hard hit, according to the Royal Bank of Canada, likely to see a 25% increase in their monthly mortgage payments in 2024. The good news is that inflation is now at approximately 3%, but in other categories, including groceries, we continue to see a year-over-year inflation that is more than double the overall inflation rate. Costs are rising in other areas too, such as gas. All of this means that many in our workforce are under pressure and they're losing ground financially. They need more money to make ends meet. The major banks in Canada have all set aside increasing amounts for bad debts over the past year, from 2 to 3 times as much. The Centre for the Future of Work had a warning about rising debt levels that is, quote, a big sign of trouble in Canada's economy. The Royal Bank of Canada cautioned in its July 2023 economic forecast for Canada that rising household debt is cutting into spending power. The Toronto Dominion Bank sees this trend continuing through next year. The overarching takeaway is reflected in this economic outlook statement from Deloitte, that the signs of slowing growth are emerging on several fronts. Let's briefly look at some specific numbers on the debt balance for the average Canadian. As we will see in this table, from auto loans to credit cards to lines of credit and mortgages, the overall effect is a 4.2% increase in total household debt for the second quarter of 2023 compared to last year. Statistics Canada said there was $1.81 in credit market debt for every dollar of household disposable income in the second quarter of 2023. Considering all of this data, one definition of debt is useful to ponder. Debt is future income used today. I'll repeat that. Debt is future income used today. The key takeaway on inflation suggests that we're at or near the peak. Major banks are consistently predicting that inflation will ease in the next year or so, and the Bank of Canada will begin to respond with an easing of interest rates at some point in 2024. CIBC suggests that easing may start in the first quarter of 2024, whereas RBC says wait until this time next year. The TD Bank is not alone in predicting that it will be approximately 2 more years before the Bank of Canada's 2% inflation target is in view. CIBC also notes that a major reason why the central bank will begin cutting early next year is due to higher unemployment. And rising unemployment, as we'll see in a moment, is certainly evident this year. Despite an improving scenario for inflation and interest rates, many people are falling behind. They will be spending less, and combined, it's a recipe for potentially a downturn in financial prospects for businesses and charities in the year ahead. I had mentioned CIBC's forecast of an easing of interest rates because of higher unemployment in 2024. Unemployment has been moving up for the past year. Currently at 5.5%, and that is the August and July rate for this year. It's been climbing from 4.9% in the summer of 2022. CIBC sees the increase continuing to about 6% in early 2024, and the TD Bank sees the unemployment further increasing to 6.5% by the end of 2024. Practically, it may mean for the average employee, the prospect of moving to a new job for higher pay in 2024 could be more challenging. The strategy to move on, to make more, is still a good one, but it will be the top performers who have the most leverage and opportunities in a tightening labor market. The data suggests employees will need to make up ground as they struggle with higher costs and higher debt. But organizations are not immune from the same economic forces, and an employer's ability to justify, let alone afford, significant compensation increases in 2024 could also be under pressure. There is data that actual salary increases this year were slightly lower than what employers had predicted a year ago, as employers grew increasingly cautious through 2023. As we turn attention to the coming year, it's helpful to look at the trend line in compensation for this year and last year. And Jeff shared some of those results with you on a previous slide with respect to the history of the Charity Village study. These reflect the broader market. In 2022, actual reported increases were in the 4 to 4.2% range based on research regularly done amongst employers in all sectors by consulting companies such as Eckler, LifeWorks Morneau, Mercer, among others. For the current year, 2023, Eckler reports that the average salary increase has been 4%. Normandin Beaudry also reported that the increase for this year was 4%. Other firms are now updating their data, including forecasts for 2024, which should be widely covered in the media in the next few weeks and available to all of us online. Normandin Beaudry has already provided a projection based on their current research that average increases will be 3.6% in 2024. 3.6% specifically is also their prediction for the nonprofit sector. This is, of course, pretty much where inflation sits at currently 3.3%, and that may be our best reference point to guide budgeting for 2024. Average increases should be at or near the rate of inflation. The caveat is to continue tracking inflation in the fourth quarter of this year and to see what results other compensation research firms provide. Today's webinar participants may be thinking about what they can do to demonstrate to their employer why an increase is justified and possibly to justify an increase that's higher than the 3.5% average that's predicted. There are a number of steps we recommend to make the case, and I'll share 6 with you with a couple of bonus tips. Most of us understand the reasons plan. They include focusing on what's most important and having a roadmap to achieve longer-term goals. A career plan is foundational and essential to guide your career progression, including one very important measure of progress, which is your level of compensation. Armed with your career plan, you can better assess each year what the steps might be to take or to keep your plan moving forward. For example, what was your salary goal for 2024 back in 2022? Or consider that if your employer was to freeze salaries for the next year or two, will your career advancement be better realized by seeking employment elsewhere? Succession planning and staff professional development are also enhanced when an employee knows where they aspire to be. Your employer may be more likely to invest in a course where an employee says at review time that I want to learn about this subject, compared to the employee who has no ideas for their self-improvement. The better supervisors will ask about your goals. It may be that your goal is to be an executive director one day. Having a plan and sharing your goals will benefit you and your employer in considering the opportunities to present and to pursue. We all know that you don't want to leave performance feedback to one meeting per year at that formal review time, and that guidance works both ways. You need, without being boastful, to be your own advocate. Make sure decision makers know how the organization is performing to its goals and the role of staff in achieving key objectives and when they have excelled beyond expectations. We all value our volunteers and know they're committed to the best interests of our organizations. We also know they're busy and likely don't have time to gather information on all aspects of their responsibilities. That's also true for supervisors. You can help by keeping them informed with reports, articles, credible data. One example may be to share the link to this webinar once posted on social media. Share research with decision makers to enable their decision making. I had noted in the coming weeks, several reputable companies will be releasing their research on compensation increases for 2024. Even where you don't have access to their full report, a link to an online resource can help the people in your organization who are making the decisions on budgets for next year. On the topic of performance reviews, I encourage you to maintain a record of what you've specifically done to add value. Where it's a positive financial result, all the better, as that could measurably demonstrate that the organization is better positioned to now reward an outstanding result. It's always good advice to put yourself in the other person's situation. On compensation, they need the justification to pay you more. Help them find the money. Having the discussion about your value in the marketplace is difficult without knowing what that value is. Fortunately, there are many places to find the information, starting with this report. But also be certain to check job boards from time to time. As was noted, Charity Village has the most robust job site in the sector. There are others available by profession, such as accounting associations, or by job function, such as event planning or government relations. They're the general ones everyone knows, like LinkedIn and Indeed. You can register for periodic job alerts to see what's available and what comparable jobs are paying. Our company, the Portage Group, does a lot of executive search in the nonprofit sector. When we're hiring for a client, we network to identify prospective candidates. It's a common outreach strategy for hiring firms. Respond to those emails, even if you don't have an interest in the job. People in my line of work have filled hundreds of jobs, and we want to know who's out there, who's doing great work, who's receptive to new opportunities. And the quid pro quo is you'll hear about the job market and compensation benchmarks. Finally, it's very important to understand your organization. Some employers' practice is to pay the average wage, as Jeff was talking about the various quartiles. Others choose by design to pay above average. Organization culture and other characteristics are influencers. If the people serving on your board are senior business leaders, for example, they may be more accustomed to paying more to retain good talent than a volunteer board with no HR and business experience. The state of an organization is also a reality check. If the trend has been declining revenues and year-end deficits, salary increases may be more challenging until that trend reverses. Also consider the sector you work in. Some sectors are predicted to have higher than average salary increases in 2024, such as high tech, professional, and scientific services, and that may well translate into people working in the nonprofit sector in jobs such as IT. If higher salaries for staff translates to higher fees for programs and services, boards of directors may be especially conservative in an economic environment that is likely contracting. Jeff's provided us with great detail on how to best use the Charity Village report. I'll add a note just to reinforce on this theme of being realistic. Occasionally we hear from upset employees who ask us why they're not earning the average salary that's paid in their market. In this example, let's say the market is Toronto. The answer is usually because not every organization in one market is the same. As Jeff pointed out, we need to look at all of the different factors and considerations, data points. If you're employed by a very small charity compared to others in the region, it usually follows that compensation will be more influenced by factors such as size versus just location. Money conversations can be emotional, and you want to always stay on brand as the consummate professional. Keep in mind that your own personal situation is truly your own. If you have a monthly payment you can't afford, that's not really relevant to your organization. Focus on organizational interests and making the case for your increase, which include retaining an exceptional performer. Finally, be judicious in the language you use. Stay cool. Be objective. So you follow the steps. You're prepared with a solid business case. You're armed with supportive data. What happens when the salary request is denied? In brief, play the long game if the answer is no. Keep providing good data so decision makers know the gap they should be closing. Knowing why your ask was turned down may also be about your performance and not organizational realities. That's important to know too, so you can understand how to adjust course and earn that increase next year. The board may be open to considering other recommendations, such as doing a market study among similar charities that they will see as relevant comparators. And when the answer is no to more salary, there are other alternatives. Non-monetary rewards are good strategies recommended both for employees and for employers. You might enjoy more time off. A promotion or a title change could bring immediate benefit, whether it brings a higher salary, new responsibilities to master, or can be leveraged for your next upward career move. Look to other benefits that, while they have a financial cost, they may be more affordable to the employer, an increased pension and or education course costs, for examples. There may be opportunities for professional growth, job shadowing, time away to volunteer. And with discussions about a possible move in the future to a 4-day work week, the more immediate trend about return to the office, you may have a concession to negotiate that will bring you better work-life balance. I'll conclude before we move to questions with a couple of tips. If you leave your organization and your role is an important one, so it must be replaced, consider what it costs your organization to lose you. Fees to an association, or pardon me, to an executive recruiter or to a nonprofit sector placement agency will be in the tens of thousands of dollars, depending on seniority level. Even if your employer decides to hire without outside professional assistance, there are costs from advertising to testing and the significant value of people's time to evaluate applications and conduct interviews. There is the cost of lost momentum while your job sits vacant. Once your replacement is found, there's the training time and further learning time to get up to speed. So the message here is it costs dramatically less for the employer to retain good staff than to replace them. Even when unemployment rates are rising, every day on Charity Village, you can see there are plenty of opportunities out there. If your career plan and career progress tells you it's time to move on, there's growth in a new challenge. Also consider there's no harm in testing those waters. Have that exploratory conversation when the recruiter reaches out to you. The market will decide your value. We hope that today's webinar will give you a few of those tools to achieve your compensation and career goals. Let's now turn to questions.
All right. So we have about 5 questions that we've pulled out here. 2 explaining the data, which asks for explanations of the data, and 3 kind of assessing the data and making projections. So the first 2 asking to explain the data. Is there a reason why average is used versus median, considering there are some outliers?
Generally speaking, the means and medians for most of our data do not differ terribly, so you're fine to use one or the other. We chose to use mean a long time ago, and that's what we've tracked. We find it's better overall for trending, and we do actually remove the outliers before we do the report. So again, they do tend to be close.
Okay, thank you. And the next one to explain the data. How consistent are the survey participants from year to year? And why don't you show the participant list in the published survey?
So I'll answer the second part first, which is we used to show the published list when we started the study back. We probably did it for the first 3 studies, and we end up getting only about 60% of people willing to list their names. So you do have to list, you do have to ask for permission to list the names of participants. And it's largely because, you know, as I said, we only get 60%. So, you know, there's 40% you still don't know. And it can be a deterrent to people answering. Year to year, I haven't done a formal check on how many groups are participating from year to year. We do get a lot of groups who reuse their data, probably about 30% reuse their data. And if I had to guess, there's probably about 40 to 50% overlap from year to year. But the study's also been growing in the last couple of years.
Right. Thank you. Now, this is asking you to assess the data and kind of make a projection. So based on the data gathered, do you perceive that the sector is offering competitive wages for mid-level to senior level staff? I'm not sure if you can answer that, but it's over to you.
I don't know if you want to field that one, Jack.
Yeah, I think the challenge and the key word in that question is competitive. Certainly competitive in the context of the nonprofit sector. We see data that, not surprisingly, people in certain areas of the nonprofit sector will earn more than others. So, for example, people who work in a membership association, also nonprofit, but not a registered charity, compensation is quite a bit higher than we see among registered charities. And depending on the organization, I think complexity is also a very key consideration. So if you're the CEO of a $100 million enterprise, whether that's a not-for-profit charity or a for-profit business, the complexity of that operation as a CEO, overseeing it as a CEO, compensation is relatively comparable. Now, it's going to be a little bit less in the nonprofit sector, but we have seen salaries as high as $750,000 in the nonprofit sector. And I know for a lot of people, even in the private sector, when they hear that, they go, wow, I should be working in the nonprofit sector. Those are big exceptions. But people are paid at that level because clearly their boards and the constituencies they serve see that level of value. And that's what it takes to attract and retain people with the skill necessary to be able to lead an organization of that complexity.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to actually combine the last 2 questions because they're similar in that they ask for projections. So based on your research and sector knowledge, do you have any projections for 2024, whether that's related to if employees will have bargaining power or where salaries might be heading in the sector, you know, or performance bonus related projections for 2024? Do you have any projections for next year?
Well, I don't personally have projections else other than to say, I mean, it's wildly dependent on what's going to happen with our economy. As you notice, the trend lines of the inflation to salaries, at the end of the day, the average salaries do tend to track along inflation lines. So, as our economy goes, as the inflation goes, so too does the average salary. And maybe Jack can speak a bit to it. He noted a couple projections from some of the economic firms.
Yeah, two quick points, noting we're right at the top of the hour. So you may remember in one of the slides that Jeff presented, those respondents for this study were asked to anticipate where increases may go in the coming year. Of course, they're not known until decisions are made by boards, finance committees, but at the management level, and this is at all levels of management, the range was between 2.4 and 3%, as I remember. We also referenced in my remarks that a research firm that looks broadly at all employers, including those in the nonprofit sector, is now predicting for 2024 that increases will be at 3.6%, with the caveat that, as we saw in 2023, actual increases ended up coming in below what the projections were heading into the year, because employers became increasingly cautious in the economic environment. And therefore, when they actually made those decisions, the numbers were a little bit lower than what they thought they might be last fall. So my advice to all of you is certainly consider those data points that we've shared, but also continue to monitor media reports, do your internet searches. The Morneau LifeWorks folks, the Mercers, a lot of very reputable big HR consulting firms will all be reporting in the next few weeks based on their research what they project the information to be for increases next year.
All right. Thank you very much. So Jack, Jeff, I'd like to thank you both. I'd like to also remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the webinar recording. The salary report is available on our website, the Charity Village website. So please, if you don't have it yet, please feel free to go access it there. And the executive report will also be available there. Please feel free to share the link to this webinar with your colleagues. The email will also include a survey link that you can fill out with your feedback on today's webinar. You should see a survey link pop up right here in Zoom following this session as well. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you so very much for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for our next free webinar, Strategic Planning with Your Organization, the Why, the What, and the How. You can find more information on this and all our upcoming webinars at charityvillage.com/webinars. Thank you again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.